Welcome to Geeks and Gurus. The session covers the unique challenges gaming presents for DevOps practitioners and security engineering teams. My name is Melissa Sussman. I'm a technical evangelist with Sumo Logic.
Hey there, I'm Jason Dunn, Product Marketing Manager here at Sumo Logic.
Hey, great to be here. My name is Yuval Dovrat. I'm leading a solution architecture team at AWS, focusing on our enterprise gaming customers such as Riot Games, Zynga, and Pokemon, and really happy to chat here today.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. So I think I wanted to pose a question for the group. Why do we think that gaming presents unique challenges in the world of DevOps?
I can take few examples that I think extremely challenging for game developers and game servers. A requirement for extremely low latency between the players and the game server, and B, the need to scale really quick in case a game become an overnight success. You need to scale from 1-2 servers to tens of thousands. I think it represents really unique challenges, the need to scale and the demand for low latency.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think as IT organizations are scaling, you definitely want to plan for low latency. There's often this like balancing act that happens between game developers wanting to meet the performance optimization requirements, and then of course the security analysts wanting to do and manage the countermeasures. So Jason is our security expert at Sumo Logic. What are some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we're speaking to in terms of just the really high scale activity within a given, especially let's say popular game, um, is very applicable because then you run into a lot of security challenges that are then very scaled up, right? I think at the end of the day, games can't be a fun experience or a positive user experience if the data itself isn't secure and if hackers are actually sort of ruining that experience within the game itself. I think in a lot of cases, anti-cheat software is just not enough to really secure user data or really stop the growing number of hackers from trying out many new exploits. So I think that's when kind of two-factor authentication or having kind of the right approach to how you actually monitor and analyze that data can be really helpful for trying to navigate that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, people don't want to play, they don't want to get into a game and then have it be unplayable. But of course, at the same time, you can't encrypt all game related network transmissions. So, yeah, the balancing act is definitely very key here. Um,
Yeah, I totally agree on
yeah.
that front, right? That there's this real interrelationship between kind of performance and security. And just to your point, you always have to kind of balance the two. But I think there are definitely ways in which, as long as you're staying on top of it in that really high scale environment, you can actually be successful on both fronts.
Yeah. I play a lot of different games personally. I don't know if you two play any games, but a while back, I was also playing like an MMORPG that kind of required that I host a game server, for example. And when I was trying to like manage network traffic, you have to open up your network traffic to all kinds of people coming in and out. So for my personal data, I definitely had to get very creative about how I secured it. Like I had to wipe my machine, and then I just used like my gaming PC as just something for transmitting like network transmissions. And then I took all my personal private data and then tried to put it onto like uh, a Linux boot like disk basically. And I didn't do anything like access accounts or do anything else other than have the game server running on it for like a few months, I think. So there's a lot that people have to consider, whether they're running the game servers or just like creating the games, like writing any quests or coming up with any very interesting ideas. Anyone who runs like a Minecraft server or Conan server knows what I'm talking about. That's something you have to consider if you're just even running the game, much less playing the games, or having people, optimize for others to play your games. So, some common exploits, if we can start talking about some of that. So, one common exploit that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with would be login hacking. Um, and I wanted to kind of cover some of that. It's like basically where it occurs on registration and login portals. So hackers then get access to information via API requests. So a lot of websites or even just like applications don't necessarily properly secure that data. So hackers can basically go through a series of user numbers and then get the information from that user via service endpoints. One thing that we can do is kind of start, countermeasures against that. Jason, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of how do you actually track and understand kind of how user access is occurring, and whether that's through single sign-on or kind of a roll your own user authentication tool, or like you said, there may be any number of APIs. I mean, you mentioned like what games are that we play ourselves. I mean, for sure, I'm a big fan of cycling simulation apps for sort of part of my exercise routine. And it's interesting because there's so many different social media APIs that then come into play of that being able to actually log in through several different methodologies. So I think really taking a tactical approach to understanding kind of how users are coming in and accessing those systems, and then really looking for all of the many anomalies or outliers and kind of triggering alerts and better understanding how you can actually stay on top of those anomalies is a really critical way to kind of avoid some of those user experience challenges that can arise from kind of hackers preventing people from having a safe and secure experience on those platforms.
Yuval, what do you play any games? What games do you play?
Yeah, I like actually a lot of old school game, old real-time strategy game, and old RPG games. I'm not that big on multiplayer games as I'm probably not good enough to play those, but I'm big on the old school games.
And
Yeah,
those are
that's
all single
interesting.
player for the most part, you said?
Yes, yes, I find it too hard to beat other players, and it's easier for me versus the AI. Maybe only the old AI. That's the key.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I can see
interesting.
that. Yeah.
When you consider like a lot of the I think considerations we're kind of dancing around are more around really sort of latency issues or security issues around these bigger multiplayer environments. And so I think it's also really interesting to think about just what is kind of the front end of that experience for kind of any number of different types of games as well.
Yeah, I think for certain use cases as well, like with any games that, for instance, have like a variety of service endpoints, you also open up a lot of potential for someone to actually hack your data as a player. So the service endpoints can come from a variety of places. That means like phone apps, desktop web addresses, social media applications, and if they can gain access to the API requests from any of that, or gain access to that API key pairs, the main issue that essentially you would be trying to solve for is avoiding having a user's password get sent across the internet, more than it needs to be, or stored in a cookie, put on the user's computer or mobile device or whatever, whatever it is that they're using. Like, I don't know if the cycling software uses like your phone or something like that. But I think it would be really interesting to delve a little bit into like how that might work and what red flag security analysts might actually be looking for as they're doing some remediation.
Yeah, I mean, I think even going beyond kind of the cycling example, I think and inclusive of it, there are just so many gaming apps now that are very cross-platform, right? I mean, you can use this particular app that I'm thinking of across iOS, Android, for sure on a MacBook or even on Linux and Windows for some in some cases. And so as you kind of consider or in browser, I should of course mention. And so I think to your point, there are all these many different access points, and then kind of it's great for user experience because then you're kind of coming to where the user is. But then the reality of that situation too is that there's all that many more vulnerabilities. It may be that there's a really critical vulnerability just within browser, but then that suddenly impacts the entire platform, right? So I think all of those considerations come into play of kind of um, how does it impact kind of the larger the larger any number of types of devices and all of the many considerations that come alongside that. And really being able to track both at sort of the OS level and the network level and the device level and being able to kind of pivot out on each of those, I think is really, really important to have the complete picture rather than just over rotating on saying, well, primarily our users are mobile for this game in particular. Like it's better to think in a much more cross-platform way, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, especially as people are doing things like updating payment info or like we're, playing in games that have a lot of microtransactions, um, I think you have to also kind of keep track of where those cookies might be stored, and you know also the developers themselves should also think about logging every API request, and then also probably using a different server for accessing, let's say, user login data versus the game server, like for the game itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're in a sense we're kind of also kind of dancing between like the end user experience versus what does it look like for the gaming developer themselves to consider this. And I think to your point that the API aspect is so critical here because that's the most kind of universal across any number of types of apps that would need to be tracked. And then when you're looking at those kind of API requests and looking at the actual raw messages and performing some of that analysis, then you're able to really dig in and also understand when things aren't being obfuscated properly, right? I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion now, and I know actually GitHub just rolled out a really interesting feature too around kind of the ability to really track and understand when those kind of secrets are being obfuscated properly or whether something is being revealed. So I think there are a lot of cases where like you said, the API key access comes into play, but then also who is actually who has pseudo access or who has like the more privileged access to those resources. So then that starts getting into kind of examples around, like a common example we like to talk about is sort of impossible logins, right? Where you get maybe a developer that's accessing a given set of cloud resources from simultaneously two different sides of the globe within 2 minutes of each other, just not physically possible and clearly an indicator that something is amiss. So I think that's just one concrete example of how we like to help to think through how a development team can really be aware of that resource usage and aware of kind of misusage, right, of those really critical resources.
Yeah, so in other words, like logging and tracing could be used basically to detect whether or not unauthorized user is then trying to access API keys from, different places around the globe uh, for the Superman scenario, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the raw logs can always point you back to what is actually occurring rather than kind of what conjecture is. But then also, if you can start to have those larger summaries and be able to actually monitor in a larger scale, then you're able to really start to have more of a broad-based look and like really be able to track for those specific outliers. In this case, really high outliers of unexpected spikes in that activity.
So, another interesting thing aside from like that is potentially, the problems that occur when we have DDoS attacks or like black hat players basically trying to crash servers or sort of mess with the player environment, so to speak. Like again, I've played more like MMORPGs and such, but I have played other types of games, but essentially, like if I were to try to crash a game server, I might send an attack packet continuously, maybe many times a second, to sort of like cheese a server into allowing me to easily defeat, dungeons and bosses. And then if I didn't want to be interrupted and I'm a black hat gamer, and I don't want anybody to see what I'm doing, I might also crash the zone leading up to the boss or the dungeon so no other players can then enter the zone. And then I'm the only one killing the boss without being interrupted. So, in that case, what are some ways that you might secure that?
Right. I was gonna say that's clearly gonna wreck sort of that end user experience for the gamer, right? But I think it's something that is, yeah, avoidable on development side. And as we kind of think about that, I think there are a lot of ways that you know as you're referring to, I mean, now we're really discussing more the levels of how do we actually track sort of network level traffic, or how does one go about doing that, and really understanding how a server may be getting bombarded by sort of the same packet from one client repeatedly. And that's a case where I think you can really pivot out and really set your filters up in a clever way to be able to better understand, okay, this is the broader view, but then how do we then kind of address a specific client or user or IP that may be the kind of repeat, occurrence that we want to be more aware of, and actually be able to flag the behavior around that. So it's a combination, right? I mean, it's like, I think if you're setting alerts, it's obviously you don't, I mean, speaking of bombardment, you don't want to be bombarded by too many alerts, but so long as you're kind of setting that outlier, or the anomaly detection at the kind of right threshold, then you can actually better understand these things as they occur, and then kind of set webhooks to actually trigger the next action beyond that. Um, but you can also really hone in on that kind of suspicious behavior, almost mixing and matching with the kind of impossible login example of really setting up a geo lookup operator to say, hey, what does it look like to actually confirm in a visual sense where these types of things are occurring, and then maybe test your own theories around that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like if I were to have, let's say, a botnet, for example, that would be a really good way to kind of catch me if I'm trying to do this sort of DDoS attack. Um, I think that there's also like a dev perspective and then there's an ops perspective in addition to this like security AI ops sort of stuff that you're talking about, where there's a trigger and an action and you can automatically detect these things. And for me, like if I were a developer and I were trying to run this game, for example, I might actually bother like shifting left, which is becoming a more common practice these days, and kind of think about what are the ways that I can improve the quality from the beginning of the deployment cycle. So if they're going to be taking a character and warping them to an invalid location, like a div by zero location, or taking a character rather and warping it to an invalid location, as the developer, I can then try to account for it because that's not something that the DevOps people necessarily can account for, but the game developer who's working on the app can then also uh, try to have an if else type statement that would detect when there is an invalid location for a particular character. And I don't know, like there's like various ways that you can theoretically like ban players. You could theoretically like come up with something creative, game makers. I don't know, to sort of deal with those sorts of things. But unfortunately, like there's nothing that IT could do in for the game experience in the moment once it's actually occurring, other than basically force move a character to a valid location automatically or reboot the server. So the person who's like me, if I'm running a game server and it's from my home and I'm not necessarily developing the game, it'd be very challenging for me. I'd have to just reboot the server once people start trying this stuff. Um, but yeah, what are your thoughts, Yuval?
I think, beside the security aspect, how to mitigate DDoS and all, I mean, obviously, this is major, but from my perspective, in my experience, aside from my personal interest in single player gaming, the challenges are mostly my customer facing are for multiplayer gaming. And we're seeing a lot of customers utilizing containerized environment, containers and Kubernetes to mitigate some of the challenges. So the challenges we mentioned early on are the need for low latency, the requirement for fast changes, quick scale, also something very unique for players that they lose trust really quick. If you have a bad game experience, you're probably not going to resume playing this game. So all of this lead to a lot of advantages we can gather from utilizing containerized environment generally and Kubernetes in particular. I just want to mention some of those advantages because they really help in a way to mitigate those security concerns. For example, the ease of deployment and the fact you can quickly deploy to different platforms. Let's say you develop in Mac, you can test your game server, whether it's Unix, Linux, Windows, everything, whether it's container, it's running on your laptop, you can test it and then quickly deploy it to a Kubernetes cluster. And this way you can really quick patch if you have any security concern, you can run massive automatic testing for containers relatively easily. Another thing that important to mention and can really reduce the time that it takes to deploy a new game server is the fact that many times game servers are huge, maybe 10 gigabyte. And if you have an AMI or it's some sort of an image that you deploy your instance or your VM from, it's going to take a really long time until you deploy a patch. Here you can use something that embedded in Docker. Basically, Docker have image layering. So instead of having every time the need to deploy the entire game servers, you can deploy incremental changes based on patches because you already have the core of your image, the OS, the game layer inside your host. And if you release any sort of a patch to it, it's going to be really quick. In addition, containers allows you, Kubernetes in particularly, to scale really quick. So we mentioned earlier, if you have 5 players, tomorrow you're going to have 5 million players. You don't need to take and create from scratch servers or VM. You can set auto-scaling mechanism in place to maybe track the amount of players using a game servers or to the amount of the network latency and so on, and you can do it really, really quick. So all of that is not necessarily right away solving your security issue, but once there is penetration, anything like this, it really helps you to mitigate this risk. And one last thing I will add, many times people think that adding layers with containers, slowing down actual access from players to the game server, which is not necessarily true because you can assign a physical IP to your containers. If you use EKS, you're actually going to get the VPC CNI that will automatically assign IP for you. Second, you have more layers, which can represent a risk. You have CDN, load balancer, host, container, a lot of places you can hack, but a lot of places you can filter traffic. And that way you can mitigate DDoS because each one of them can help you represent different ways that you can look for irregular behavior, irregular traffic, and filter it until it gets to your game server, which is the most vulnerable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's definitely a lot of things that I wouldn't be able to do from like my home server on-prem and my little setup that I would, that you could theoretically do as like a really large developer using AWS. There's even, I think, like events that you can get from AWS that can also like, not only do penetration testing, but you can use the events and then connect via webhooks to other, monitoring and security tools as well. But yeah.
Yep, exactly. And what's really awesome, it doesn't matter if you're running a single server or you're running millions of servers, you can use these capabilities. It's relatively quick, so it's just worth trying, see if it's working for your environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the last sort of interesting thing here is the notion of not only running is essentially having to run servers within like let's say a server object container because that does give you a lot of control. You could keep consistent environments in a game if you're doing like an MMORPG, have sort of a persistent environment, but then scale up and down according to the number of people within a certain zone in game. So even if someone does try doing something like a DDoS attack, there is a little bit more, well, maybe even a lot more, potential for that not necessarily just like fully crashing, all the zones leading up to that dungeon boss. It would obviously affect a certain server object container and then the game environment within that area. But assuming people do things like server meshing, the you can also through scalability sort of prevent people from like ruining the game experience for everybody else within that zone or even on the zones leading up to it.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, folks. This has been a really awesome conversation and really great kind of sharing the stage with y'all.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Thank you
Thanks so
for
much.
thank you for joining us, you all. We really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, it was awesome being here. Thanks for inviting me.